Many people who work with computers use proprietary software programs, like Windows. We generally pay the price and agree to the license terms for this software, presuming that because there is a major company behind it, it should be reliable, and if anything goes wrong, support will be available. The source code, which enables you to see how the program works, is generally not available to users. Then there's freeware. Software products that are available on the internet for download and use without charge. These products may request an optional fee. Shareware products can be downloaded for a free trial, but then have to be purchased if you want to use the product beyond the trial period. Most software termed freeware or shareware requires you to agree to license terms, under which you are not allowed to copy, modify, or redistribute the software. Usually, the user is not provided with the source code. Open source software is different from software like Windows, and from most freeware and shareware. It is often free from any charge. The term open source is a term that describes software for which some of the rights, usually reserved for copyright holders, are provided under a software license, meeting the open source definition that is in the public domain. It allows modifications to be made, can be redistributed, and always requires the source code to remain publicly available. The list of software terms goes on. There's copylefted software, non-copylefted software, semi-free software, private software, commercial software, and many more. But arguably, the most radical movement in software terms is the Free Software Foundation. Software that is free in this sense is both free from any restriction on its use, modification, or redistribution, and also has its source code made available to users. The basis of the Free Software Foundation is that proprietary software, such as Windows, is unjust and unethical, and that all software should be free to be shared and modified. It states that free software is software that respects the user's freedom. The founder of the movement is Richard Stallman, a self-styled software freedom activist. He began developing GNU, a complete Unix-compatible operating system, in 1983. GNU stands for GNU's Not Unix. The system was released in 1992 after Linux, a Unix-style kernel, was developed. We caught up with Richard after a conference in Chicago for an impromptu discussion about his ethical stance, and firstly asked him to clarify the difference between free software and open source software.
The free software philosophy is based on ethical values. We're concerned with freedom to control our own computing and freedom to cooperate with each other. The open source philosophy refers to pretty much the same software, but presents the issue in amoral terms. It cites only values of practical convenience. So the supporters of open source will argue that if you use their recommended development model, that your software is likely to be more powerful and convenient and reliable. And if that's true, I'd say it's a nice bonus of respecting people's freedom. But freedom is far more important than that bonus. Whether that bonus works or not is a side issue. I wouldn't give up my freedom to get more powerful, reliable, or convenient software anyway. So if it turns out that respecting other people's freedom also has these side benefits, that's nice. And if the result is that some people who don't appreciate freedom itself will also join us in building freedom, that's more than nice. But still, I think that the people who talk about open source are missing the most important point, and that's why I won't join them. I never describe my work as open source. I'm not a supporter of open source. I'm a free software activist because I'm aware that if we are to establish freedom in a lasting way, the most important thing we must do is teach people what freedom means and teach people to appreciate it and demand it.
The free software movement refers to 4 freedoms. These are the freedom to run a program for any purpose, the freedom to study how the program works and change it to make it do what you wish, the freedom to redistribute copies so you can help your neighbour, and the freedom to improve the program and release your improvements to the public so that the whole community benefits. What do these 4 freedoms represent?
Freedom to distribute copies to others is what makes it possible for you to cooperate with your community. Thus, proprietary software which denies people freedom too is an attack on social solidarity. It's an attempt to divide people and conquer them. That's very directly and obviously unethical. Society is based on cooperating. And when you tell people they're not allowed to cooperate, you are sabotaging society. That's what proprietary software does. The other freedoms are essential so that we, the users, can have control over our software. We've got to be free to run it as we wish. That is, the developer of the program must not have the power to restrict what we can do with it. And we must be free to change the software so that it will do what we want it to do. In other words, the developer of the program must not have control over what the program can do for us. And we have to be free to cooperate in improving the program. That's why we need freedom 3, the freedom to distribute your modified versions. Without that, each of us would be free personally to improve a program, but we'd be limited to the changes we could personally make. And since most computer users don't know how to program, they couldn't get any changes. That is not having control. With the 4 freedoms, the result is that the users together have control over the development of the software. So a free program develops democratically under the control of its users. And all the users get the benefit of the 4 freedoms. Every user can exercise freedoms 0 and 2, the freedom to run the program and to distribute exact copies. You can only exercise freedoms 1 and 3, the freedom to modify the program and then to distribute copies of your modified version, to the extent you know how to program. Of course, there are a few who are very good at this and a somewhat larger number who could do it somewhat, and then a large number who never tried to learn it at all. Those people can't directly exercise freedoms 1 and 3, but when programmers do that and release their modified versions, everybody gets to install them. And the result is, well, everybody gets to install them or not as they wish. So everybody gets the benefit of the changes that people make, and everybody gets to decide which changes they'll use. And the result is the users control the development. By contrast, with a proprietary program, there is a developer who dictates what the program will do, and all use of the program goes on under the dictatorship of that developer. And all users of the program are under the power of that developer. This is the injustice that we aim to put an end to.
It seems that more people have heard of Linux than free software or GNU. What might the reason be?
More people have heard the name Linux than the name GNU, even though what they're talking about is GNU. This is a confusion that got started in 1992, about 8 years after we started developing the GNU system, when the system was almost finished, but one major important component was missing, the kernel. So at that point, Torvalds liberated Linux, his kernel, by re-releasing it under a free software license. At that point, it was possible to take the almost finished GNU system and add Linux, the kernel, and get a complete free system, which was basically GNU with Linux added. But the people who made this combination and started to distribute and promote it got confused. They started calling the combination Linux. And that's why most of the users of the GNU system think that it's Linux, but that's an error. So even if it's only for the sake of giving the system's principal developers some credit, please call the system GNU/Linux. Give us equal mention. Since we started it and the vision was ours and we did the biggest part of the job, we ought to get equal mention, I think.
So, how successful is the free software movement?
We've made a great start and we have a long way to go. So we have developed now at least 2 free operating systems. There's GNU/Linux and there's BSD. Each one has various variants, of course. And there may be others that are less important. I don't know which ones of them actually work well enough to use. And of course, there are also thousands of useful free application programs. But this isn't enough. We need thousands more free application programs to do all the jobs that users are likely to want to do. And you can see that a few percent of the users are running free operating systems, but that still leaves nearly all of them running user-subjugating proprietary operating systems. So we have a long way to go to reach our goal, which is the liberation of cyberspace and everyone in it.
What about the objection that if all software were free, programmers would go out of business?
I suspect that those people have misunderstood what free software means. It doesn't mean gratis. It means freedom respecting. So to understand the word free in the combination free software, think of free speech, not free beer. So if all software developers respected the freedom of their fellow beings, would this mean all programmers would go out of business? Certainly not, because there are a substantial number of people who are being paid to develop free software now. And the other thing is to note is that most paid programmers are not developing proprietary software for release to the public in an unethical way. And they're also not developing free software for release to the public in an ethical way. They're developing custom software. So they're almost outside of the question. It's only a small fraction of programmers that are developing software for release to the public, which could be free or proprietary. So even if we ignore the fact that many programmers are being paid to make that software free, that's such a small fraction of all paid programming that in terms of economics, it's insignificant. But let's imagine, fictitiously, that all the programmers that were paid were developing unethical proprietary software. What would that imply? It would imply that they should stop and they should find some other work to do. Or they should go on the dole. Because it's not legitimate to trample other people's freedom merely so that you can get some money.
Computers are increasingly crucial to the infrastructure of government, public services, education, and so on. In considering what software they should use, what is at stake?
The future of society in its use of computers, whether society will be free or a dictatorship of corporations, is what's at stake, and it's even more true for developed, richer countries. The issue of freedom is the same wherever you are, unless you're so poor that you don't have a computer, in which case you are sort of lucky that this one problem, out of all the many problems in life, at least you don't have to worry about. But once you start using computers, this issue applies to you just as to everyone else. Schools must teach exclusively free software. Now, part of the reason is that they shouldn't waste their money paying for licenses, but that's superficial, and some proprietary software developers eliminate that reason by donating gratis copies of their non-free software to schools. And why do they do this? it's not because they want to contribute to education. It's because they want to corrupt the schools into instruments of making all society into customers of those companies. They want the schools to be places that teach people to be dependent on certain software, so that after they graduate, they'll graduate with this dependence. So this company will hand gratis copies to the school the same way that a drug pusher might give gratis doses of addictive drugs to the school, saying, inject it into all your students. Of course, once they graduate, then they'll have to pay. Ha 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 ha. And this shows what the school should respond. They should refuse to participate. Schools should never teach people how to use proprietary software that imposes a dependence on society. Because schools are supposed to teach the next generation how to be citizens of a strong, free, capable, and solid society. So they should be teaching only how to use free software, which is the software which encourages and leads to those results. But there's a deeper reason, which is for the education of the best programmers. At the age of 13 or so, some people who are natural-born programmers want to learn everything about the computer system. So if they're using a program, they want to know how it works. But when the student asks the teacher, how does this program work? If it's proprietary, the teacher has to say, I'm sorry, it's a secret. You're not allowed to learn. Education is not permitted. But if the program is free, the teacher can say, here's the source code. Read it all and you'll understand everything. And he will read it all because he's fascinated and he wants to understand everything. And this is the way these natural-born programmers learn to program well. You learn to program well by reading lots of code and writing lots of code. Free software gives you the opportunity to do that. Not only just to read the code, but then to write extensions or fix the bugs you encounter. That's how you learn the very important job of how to change an existing program, which is, by the way, most of what programming is. Even if you originally wrote the program, most of the work you do on it is going to be changing an existing program. You know, when it's 5 years after you first started it, the fact that you originally wrote it 5 years ago doesn't make any difference anymore. What you're doing is extending an existing program. So this experience is the experience in doing what most of the work is. And only free software makes it possible. Every school in the world can make it possible for these particular talented students to learn how to do this well if they run free software. But there's an even deeper reason, and that is for the sake of moral education, education and citizenship. Because schools are supposed to teach not just facts and techniques, but above all, how to be to teach people to be good citizens, which means teaching the habit of helping your neighbor, the spirit of goodwill. So every class should have a rule. Students, if you bring software to class, you can't keep it for yourself. You must distribute copies to the rest of the class. However, the class has to follow its own rule, which means the school can only bring free software to class.
The idea of a software tax has been suggested. What is the thought behind this?
Suppose we had a world in which all software were free. And suppose people thought that the total investment in software development was not sufficient. Well, this is one among many ways you could use to increase it. Suppose you put a tax on some activity relating in some way to using computers and software, like maybe internet connectivity. And then suppose you disperse that money to software development projects. And you could have a board like the National Science Foundation decide what to spend it on, except that anybody who paid enough money that he cared what it got spent on, that is, anyone who's paid enough taxes, that he cared what his own taxes got spent on, could decide to spend his taxes on any bona fide software development project. So everybody would have to be contributing to software development, and if you care enough, you could choose which software development, and if you didn't care enough, you'd let someone else choose.
There have been many general protests about proprietary software and the hold it has over society and the individual. However, there has also been quite a lot of resistance to the creation and promotion of free software. Why might this be?
Social inertia. Once you open your eyes to noticing the operation of social inertia, you'll see it all around. Most people are using Microsoft Windows. That leads a lot of other people to want to use Microsoft Windows just because that's what they see around them. That's probably what they get the first chance to learn. Well, once that converts the social inertia into personal inertia. And a lot of programs are written only to run on Microsoft Windows, which is another phenomenon of social inertia. And then you might get people mailing you files, their own files, in formats that were designed by Microsoft and only work on Windows. And then there are websites that are designed such that they can only be accessed from Windows. Now, this is an outrage, and people should complain to the operators of those sites and say, hey, I'm not going to do any business with you until you fix your site. But the problem is, because we are such a minority, these various unfair practices go on, and our ability to resist them is pretty small, especially since most of the users of the GNU/Linux system have never heard the ideas of free software. They've only heard the more widely diffused but shallower ideas of open source. Those ideas run into less resistance, so they spread faster. The reason they run into less resistance is because they're shallower and they don't rock any ethical boats. A lot of companies are happy to promote open source, but the idea that users deserve freedom is too shocking for them to want to touch it. So the result is we have millions of users, actually tens of millions of users, but most of them never heard about the freedoms that we have tried to give them. So they don't participate in defending those freedoms when they're threatened. And they don't see that the fact that a certain website only works with Internet Explorer means that that institution is doing something bad and that they should be pressured until they change.
Could there ever be a day when GNU Linux begins to dominate the market?
I can't foretell the future. We may win and we may lose. And it depends above all on the people who are watching this recording. If you join in our campaign for freedom, we may win. And if you don't, if you sit on the sidelines, maybe then we'll lose.
Many advocates of free software see the issue of software freedom as tied up with issues of intellectual property, a concept that they think should be rejected. Richard Stallman challenges the reality of intellectual property. He states that there is no such unified thing as intellectual property. It is a mirage. Perhaps there are important differences between software and things like music, poetry, novels, or even pharmaceutical research, where a great deal of investment can be involved in the discovery of a treatment or cure. When asked whether the four freedoms should be applied in such areas, Stallman seems to acknowledge this.
These ideas of free software do extend naturally to other kinds of works of functional use, works that you use to do jobs. And these include software, they include recipes where the job is cooking some food, they include educational works where the job is to learn or teach, they include reference works where the job is to look up what something means, they include text fonts where the job is printing some text, and maybe some other kinds of things. But I wouldn't extend all of the same conclusions to works of opinion or art and entertainment. For those, I would say the minimum freedom that we must have is the freedom to non-commercially redistribute exact copies, which is just a part of freedom number 2 for free software. Because freedom number 2 for free software, the freedom to redistribute exact copies, includes giving away copies and selling copies. You can do either one, whichever you like, whenever you like. But for these other kinds of works, I'm only saying that the minimal freedom is the freedom to non-commercially redistribute exact copies, which means giving them away, and not in connection with any sort of business activity. That's the minimum freedom necessary because that's what it takes to allow social solidarity. If you don't have that freedom, then you're trying to divide and conquer individuals.
There are enormous problems in the world today, involving huge injustice and social need. On the list of things that need to be addressed, just where does the fight for free software come?
Different people have different talents, and thus the answer would be different for different people. The reason I chose to start the free software movement is that software was my field. And if I didn't start the free software movement, I would have been personally directly involved in the evil of non-free software. So it was absolutely essential that I work to escape from doing that evil and put an end to it. That doesn't apply to everybody. There are people who don't have to use computers at all, and I wouldn't argue that free software is the most important ethical cause that they should be fighting for. And if you just compare the cause's importance independent of how much good person P could do for one or another, there are more important causes, limiting overpopulation and global warming, bringing back human rights that Bush and Blair have crushed. These are, in the abstract, more important. But I didn't see a way to strike a tremendous blow for those things. Whereas I did have the opportunity to strike a tremendous blow for computer users' freedom in using their software. And that's because of the skills I had and the awareness I had. Probably no one else would have started the free software movement if I had not. So, how important it is for you to work on solving a particular social problem depends partly on how many others are already working on it or likely to. And I was aware of a social problem that was growing and that hardly anybody recognized as one. So I had to try to solve it. It was either me or no one. So I'm sure I made the right decision to do that rather than, say, become one more activist in Amnesty International, say. On the other hand, what's best for you to do, well, that depends on your situation. But if you're a programmer, then you at least have the responsibility not to be making things worse. So you have the responsibility, the duty not to be developing proprietary software.
Higher education establishments, like the University of Leeds, are keen for students to consider ethical issues within IT and computing. What might be the most important ethical issues they will be faced with?
Don't subjugate your users, and don't help Big Brother spy on people. So, for instance, it's unethical to work on Blair's road charging scheme or any of his other surveillance schemes. Keeping records of where everyone is or where everyone goes, that's horrible. That's the sort of power that creates a dictatorship.
There are many ethical questions in computing, and the free software movement brings a number of these issues to the fore. As part of his campaign for free software, Richard Stallman challenges the very idea of intellectual property. Stallman says that a programmer isn't entitled to restrict the use of their software because they don't ultimately own the code. Indeed, nobody owns code. But perhaps the issues of software freedom and intellectual property are not so tightly connected as Stallman suggests. If the only water supply in a village is on your land, you still might be obliged to allow others free access to it. And even if Stallman is wrong about intellectual property, he might be right that software ought to be provided to users free from restrictions, that all software should be free software. To users brought up on Windows, the free software movement may appear to be extreme, but you may well identify with some, if not all, of the issues raised. Virtually everyone uses software and has a choice about what kind of software to use. It's up to the individual to ensure their choice of software is based on careful consideration of the arguments.